like to welcome you very warmly, particularly the participants in this evening's program, which I consider to be day one of a 3-day conference on breaking the silence, as you see on the PowerPoint. So I warmly welcome the representatives, and I'll introduce them as they come to do their part in this evening's proceedings. First off, I would like to just say a few notes to say that, first of all, I'm extremely excited, and I await very anxiously to hear the presentations this evening. This is a project that has been going on for quite a long time, as you will hear later in the program. And what's very interesting to me is that it's not only gender, but certainly multi-sectoral. And so we have participants from different disciplines and sectors in society, and more importantly, it's action-oriented, as you're going to be hearing over the next 2 days. So without further ado, because we're going to be hearing a lot more about this project, I'm going to call on the head or director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Dr. Piya Pangsapa, who is going to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. Dr. Pangsapa.
Good evening, everyone. As head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, I join my colleagues in welcoming you, distinguished guests, and all of our distinguished guest speakers tonight to the Break the Silence End Child Sexual Abuse Regional Conference. The purpose of this conference is to share with you the findings from this research and action project that began in 2008. And I would just like to take this opportunity to applaud Professor Rhoda Reddock, Dr. Sandra Reed, and Tisha Nickening, the research project coordinator, and Catherine Chan, who's the project's media coordinator, both of whom are IGDS staff members, and the rest of the research team for their hard work, commitment, and dedication to this pressing and important issue. This project is part of a larger research program of the IGDS in collaboration with UNICEF and the UN Trust Fund for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and it was carried out under a framework for gender equity, child protection, and human rights. One of the major aims is to bridge the gap between theory and practice, that is, action-oriented research and service delivery related to sexual violence, with a particular focus on child sexual abuse and HIV/AIDS. So it's really wonderful to see representatives of organizations from across all sectors of civil society, and of course, the civic-minded citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who are here tonight. I know that we are all committed to ending child sexual abuse, which is the long-term goal of this project. And over the next 2 days, the project researchers will share with us their research findings, which I'm sure will trigger and motivate an engaging and constructive dialogue, and which ultimately must lead to action. So, on behalf of the IGDS, I welcome you to this important conference, which is the first step towards ending child sexual abuse and incest. Thank you.
And I'm very pleased indeed to call to the podium Professor Rhoda Reddock, who is our Deputy Campus Principal of the UWI St. Augustine. She is a professor of gender, social change, and development, and she has worked in a number of areas, as you will probably see coming out from her presentation. She has researched and published in women's labor and labor history, feminism and women's movement, gender and the environment, gender and development, Caribbean masculinities, gender, ethnicity, and identity, and more recently, of which this project is a part, gender and sexuality. So without further ado, I'd like to call to the podium Professor Rhoda Reddock.
Thank you very much for being here at this opening ceremony. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the head of the IGDS, Dr. Piya Pangsapa, from whom you heard just before, Dr. Lincoln Douglas, the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of the People and Social Development. We are very happy that he has graced us with his presence. My fellow researcher, Dr. Sandra Reed, Dr. Adele Jones, the Professor of Childhood Studies at Huddersfield, and our keynote speaker, Mr. Tom Olson, Regional Director of UNICEF, which was one of our major funders, Professor Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, another guest speaker, Ms. Tammy Yates, who tonight, of UNFPA, who's representing the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, our other major funder, other members of the Break the Silence research team, our project partners, members of our communities, relevant NGOs, government departments, and I must mention Ms. Milan Kidane of UNICEF, who has worked closely with us over the years, my UE colleagues, students, other colleagues of the IGDS, and other specially invited guests. Good evening once again. It is my pleasure, on behalf of the campus and the university management, to welcome you all to the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. For those of you who are visiting our campus and our country for the first time, I hope that you will get the opportunity to see something more of it than you would within the walls of the conference. The UWI is pleased to be associated with a project like this that takes us beyond the walls of the campus into the communities that we are supposed to serve. I would also like to mention, I see our campus registrar in the audience, Mr. Callahan. Thank you very much for being here with us this evening. I would especially like to welcome old friends of this project. I don't know if Professor Dorothy Roberts is already here. Professor Roberts is Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Northwestern University School of Law, and she was a Fulbright Scholar at the then Center for Gender and Development Studies when we began to conceptualize this research program. The larger research program is entitled Gender, Sexuality, and the Implications for HIV. Professor Adele Jones, our keynote speaker, was part of the initial project team for this Breaking the Silence component of the project and involved in its initial conceptualization. Unfortunately, she left us for greener pastures, but you will be hearing from her later on. She did not end her commitment to this area. Dr. Wesley Critchlow, also a former visiting scholar of the IGDS, whose work has been in the area of criminal justice and alternative dispute resolution and mediation, and closer to home, Dr. Diane Douglas, who was also involved during the first phase of the project. And during the first phase of this program, we sought to review the state of the art in gender and sexualities research and to carry out a number of preliminary investigations. These included an analysis of the data of the 10 years of the National HIV/AIDS Hotline. We did a focus group study of behaviors, attitudes, and taboos related to sexuality among UWI students at the St. Augustine campus. We organized a regional symposium on gender, sexualities, and implications for substance abuse and HIV, out of which came a book, Sex, Power, and Taboo. And we compiled an annotated bibliography, Gender, Sexuality, and Implications for HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean, which should be available for sale during the course of the conference. We also held a stakeholders meeting of government and social sector partners to identify key areas of concern. And one of the issues emergent from this stakeholders meeting was the need to examine the taboo issue of incest and child sexual abuse. According to the reports of the stakeholders, this was widespread but unmarked. To some extent it existed, but there was unclarity on how this problem should be approached. The conference that we opened this evening, therefore, presents preliminary findings of this component of the research program. And I must mention here that there is another component, building policy, looking at Caribbean sexual cultures. And I just want to do a little promo. I've been asked to let you know that the national consultation for that project takes place on the 16th of May, and the regional symposium on that project on the 23rd and 25th of May, and that will include 2 other projects from Barbados and Suriname. Now, this particular project, Breaking the Silence, a multisectoral approach to assessing child sexual abuse and incest, has the broad aims to generate gender-sensitive knowledge and understanding on child sexual abuse and incest and implications for HIV, and to understand the meanings underlying these practices and the ways in which it is rationalized, understood, and dealt with. It also seeks to empower women, girls, men, and boys to address these issues and to influence service providers to understand the linkages between child sexual abuse and incest, gender, and HIV, and to influence policies overall. This was an action research project in that it aimed both to investigate and to find out information, but at the same time to use this information to inform, to sensitize, to empower, and to influence individual action and policy, for example, health, social policy, gender policy, education, and family policy. Hence, we use the term multisectoral. In other words, we realized from the start that addressing this issue would require the involvement and partnership with a number of state and non-state actors and agencies. Our main partner for this project was the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Childline, which is a children's hotline. But there were many others who are listed at the back of the conference program. I don't know if it's also listed at the back of this program. I must mention here Arts in Action, the UWI Theatre and Education Organization, and you'll be hearing more about them this evening, which was a major contributor to the community interventions, and the Caribbean Health Research Council, which provided an ongoing evaluation support, which was an intrinsic component of every aspect of this exercise. Over the next 2 days, the components of this project will be explored in greater detail, so this evening I'm only giving a brief overview. The main components were as follows: a literature review on child sexual abuse throughout the Caribbean, a legislative review of existing laws and legislation related to children, child sexual abuse, and sexual violence and incest in Trinidad and Tobago, including the package of children's legislation that is to be established in this country. We also did a study of service providers and agencies that work with children, and this was a research study based on interviews with service providers and agency heads, state and non-state, about existing protocols, policy guidelines, referral systems, gender sensitivity, HIV/AIDS, referrals, perceptions of how protocols are being implemented, constraints and barriers, etc. We also had community interventions in 3 selected communities, 2 in Trinidad and 1 in Tobago, and these activities in these interventions were determined by each community based on their needs and interests. Prior to beginning these interventions, we carried out some brief ethnographic case studies in each of the 3 communities to develop an understanding of the sociocultural context of the community, as well as to identify key community stakeholders and potential informants, as well as the gendered cultures of that community. Very important was the Break the Silence, End Child Sexual Abuse media campaign. So the project was Breaking the Silence. The campaign is Break the Silence. And this may better be described as a multimedia campaign and not simply as a media campaign. And this occurred alongside the community interventions and continues today. Indeed, as I have mentioned on numerous occasions, a Tobago stakeholder at one of our initial meetings mentioned that they could not wait until the research component of the project was over for a public campaign to begin. He said, "We need it now." This was taken on board, and our very able media consultant, Catherine Chan, took this on like a runaway train. Everyone here is probably now familiar with the blue teddy symbol. I see some people here in our blue teddy t-shirts. Welcome. and some of us already have our blue teddy pins, but over the next 2 days, you'll have the opportunity to get them if you don't have. And we hope that those of you who are here visiting from overseas would assist us to make this an international symbol, an international emblem of the campaign to end child sexual abuse. Some of the other initiatives of this multimedia campaign included posters and postcards, a Facebook course, a documentary film, community billboards, including digital billboards, newspaper articles, and media interviews. We also, at the last minute, carried out a content analysis of newspaper clippings. This is because I am really a newspaper junkie and could not resist cutting out every newspaper clipping that I could find related to incest and child sexual abuse. I think when we found we had so many, we decided we should use them as part of the project. And we therefore added another component, which was a content analysis of these newspaper clippings. And this was done by Dr. T.S. Smith-Cooper and will also be presented over the next 2 days. Finally, influencing policy was an important component of the project, influencing policy and policymakers. And we have already begun this process with a presentation to the Children's Authority Board and the UWI School of Education. And we also hosted a policy roundtable presenting data primarily from the study on the service providers to senior policymakers last month. We thank all those busy policymakers for turning out and participating so enthusiastically, and we look forward to future collaboration with them. One result is that we now have lots of data still to analyze, so we are still accepting offers for further funding. One of the most exhilarating aspects of this project has been the way in which it has moved beyond us. We have been inundated with requests for radio and television appearances. And after our initial participation in the Justice for Children March in Port-au-Spain, spearheaded by the Jericho Project, other communities have asked for our technical support to host their own Breaking the Silence marches, beginning with San Fernando, followed by Couva, then Tunapuna, then Barrackpore, complete with the Kaisoka Mokojambis, handmade placards, their own T-shirts and banners, paid for through local sponsorship, with Owen, the blue teddy mascot, and of course, Roy and Gloria. These marches have captured the imagination and ignited a population ready to address what we now agree is a national problem, not limited to any one or two communities. I have been advised that more marches are planned based on community requests. I must say that we at IGDS do not organize these marches. Roster Advertising offered their wall for 3 months, and other walls have now been painted in Tunapuna, Barrackpore, and in Dibe. The Calypsonian and extempo artist Black Sage has written a calypso, which you should hear at the end of the conference, and 2 young girls read some of the words at the post-march activity in Barrackpore last Saturday. Catherine was rejoicing recently that whereas in the beginning there was hesitation in using the word sexual in some of these early activities, last Saturday in Barrackpore, the mic man, the mic man is a man who drives around in a car saying, giving the announcing, at the head of the march pulled no punches when he called on the community to join the march against child sexual abuse. I would like to publicly thank all the persons who have been working throughout the country, the unsung heroes, and you know who you are. And it was not my intention today to mention any names because I was so afraid of leaving out the name of any important contributor. However, Catherine has asked that I mention Zorida Idu of the South Breaking the Silence Committee, Zora Risal Singh, leader of the Barrackpore Breaking the Silence Committee, Anthony Ramkisoon of the South Breaking the Silence Committee, Jennifer Khan of the Couva Breaking the Silence Committee, as well as Catherine Ali from South, Sintra Guinness Dabi of South, and Stacy Samaru of the Aruka Breaking the Silence Committee. She also asked that I mentioned Anna Maria Mora of the Mariama Children's Museum, who has also given his support. So if I've left out any names, ask Catherine, not me. I would be amiss if I didn't mention the outstanding contribution of our hardworking and committed project coordinator, Tisha Nikonig. Without Tisha, I don't think we would be here today. Tisha has managed us, organized us, and ensured that we would meet sometimes when it was very difficult, and ensured that we would stick as far as we could to the many deadlines that we had. Tisha, on behalf of all of us in the research team, thank you very much for your commitment, your hard work, your discipline, and your professionalism. Bearing in mind the many long-term negative impacts of child sexual abuse on children, young people, and adults in our society, anger, mental illness, inability to form intimate relationships, HIV risk, self-harm, addiction, etc., I think that all the persons involved are making an important contribution to our country as a whole, and we applaud you for this. Finally, I must mention, on Sunday evening, I received a telephone call from a retired medical social worker living in Barrackpore. Her name was Savitri Nobby. She informed me of efforts made by social workers and others in the late 1980s and 1990s to have this issue addressed, and mentioned a training manual that they had prepared at that time. She also mentioned Joan Bishop, a former head of the National Family Services, as one of the other persons deeply involved. I want to publicly recognize these earlier efforts and the unnamed persons that went before, and all the other individual and collective efforts that have been made in the past. We cannot claim to be the first or the only persons to raise this issue, and we certainly will not be the last. We may be luckier today, however, because, as Ms. Nobby concluded in her conversation with me, it seems as if the society is ready to deal with this issue now. Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, colleagues all, I sincerely hope that this is the case. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Reddock, for giving us, as director of this project, a brief overview, and I'm sure all of you will be excited to find out what's happening in the further presentations. And now we're going to get a film presentation, which is going to give us another introduction to Break the Silence project.
This project is a project coming out of the Center for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies. It is a research project that looks at child sexual abuse over a 3-year period. So this year we're into our action research intervention, which really means that instead of passively getting information, we are embarking on skills building, on disseminating information, on education. So while we're receiving information about perceptions, about attitudes, about the actual incidents of child sexual abuse, we are also giving information. We're teaching parents about parenting. We are teaching teachers about what are the legal implications and what is the legal framework as pertains to child sexual abuse. What is their responsibility? We assume that teachers have this information, but a lot of them don't because it has not really been passed on. So we're doing that in the process.
Mommy, I can talk to you about something.
Yes, you can talk to me, but do work while you're talking now.
A group came in school today and talked about good touches and bad touches. Mommy, I can't be home and Uncle Cecil at home again.
Why not?
Mommy, Uncle Cecil will be touching me.
child sexual abuse is a taboo area, there's so much fear. What if everybody knows that, if people suspect that I have been abused based on what I say in a workshop? What if maybe I have my own issues? You know, the statistics about child sexual abuse are alarming. I sit in a room with 10 women, chances are that 6 of them have been abused. In a room with 10 men, chances are that 4 or 5 of them have been abused. So it is such an emotionally charged and loaded area that I think it's not so much a wall, but there's a lot of fear. And once you have to create an environment that's non-judgmental, you have to create an environment that you convey that what we really want to do is rap and talk about this. And once you do that, people's fears begin to lessen a little bit, and then you get through to them. When you come into an environment like this, where you don't have to stay, no child here had to stay, and you see people stay at 5 minutes after the school bell has gone, that says that we have reached them. So I was blown away again, because we ran right up to the edge of time. I think we finished 5 minutes after school call, and they stayed. They stayed to hear the Arts in Action song at the end. They stayed, and as they were leaving, children who were really upset, like, why I have to move my desk? Was Miss, you want to put back my desk? You know, and sometimes that's how you really judge the impact of a workshop, by the fact that people stay, by the fact that people they respond yes, they answer your question yes, and that they're engaged. Also remember that when faced with 3 scenarios, they chose the scenario that dealt with child sexual abuse. That also tells us something. This is the 2nd time we have done this Arts in Action workshop since we've been doing this intervention. The first time was in Tobago, and the same thing happened. That tells me that our young people, and they're on average 15 and 14 years old, they want to talk about this. It says that, because they could have talked about the barber shop, they could have talked about the birthday party. Those are two scenes that are very familiar. It have to do with boy-girl stuff and flirting, but they wanted to talk about this uncle who they suspected was sexually abusing this little girl. So I think that speaks a volume about the impact of the workshop. I think if anyone who is part of any part of this intervention leaves and they know to themselves that I do not have to be silent, then we have succeeded. And if at 15, or at 18, at 14, you know that silence is not your only option, then I think we've done something.
So take my hand and tear to hold. I am right here, you can talk to me right now. When nothing makes sense, it's up to you to break. It's up to you to break. It's up to you to break. Break the silence.
Thank you to the producers of this film and Arts in Action as well. Now we go on to the next item on the program, and we're hearing about all of the different policies that the research data is going to be impacting on. But one, of course, one ministry that is very key in all of this is the Ministry of People and Social Development. And so we're very, very pleased indeed that we do have the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of People and Social Development, Dr. Lincoln Douglas, who is a communications specialist, and communication is a very key aspect of this project, and we'd like to invite him to give some remarks. Dr. Douglas.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Dr. Grace Sirju-Charran. I'm happy to be here amongst the distinguished presenters and guests, Dr. Pangsapa and Professor Rhoda Reddock, representatives from the United Nations Trust Fund, Mr. Tom Olson from UNICEF, Dr. Sandra Reed and Professor Adele Jones. I am delighted to be here. Reason being, as the chairman says, our ministry, the Ministry of the People and Social Development, we are in the throes right now of determining and trying to pass legislation that deals with the safety and the protection of children. This is a significant piece of legislation that we call the Children's Bill, and it deals with about 5 or 6 pieces of legislation. It deals with adoption. Then there's one called the Children Bill. Then there's the Children's Authority Act, which gives power to, which brings into force an organization that would be primarily responsible for children's well-being and actually would be the centerpiece of the whole package of legislation. Children's Community Residences, Foster Care and Nurseries Act, which deals with places that provide care, safety, and protection for children, and what should be the standard and the way of functioning in these organizations. The Family Court Bill is also part of this. The International Child Abduction Act and the Status of Children Bill. All of these are at present in one or the other state of being on the way to being proclaimed. At present, we're working feverishly through the Children's Bill. I've brought it along with me, and I will leave it because we're kind of in the final stages of presenting it to Parliament, and we are prepared to accept and to include in the mix all the contributions from various stakeholders. We went through it today again, and there were quite additional contributions, and they form another subcommittee of the subcommittee to go through it again, because we certainly don't want it to get, because this bill started in 2008, went through Parliament, and got sent back because of a few things, you know? And so we're trying to cover all the bases again. The Children's Bill, as I said, is a very, very critical piece of legislation that deals with the protection of children, and it's quite an extensive piece of bill that deals with sexual offenses, offenses relating to dangerous drugs and tobacco and alcohol, prevention of cruelty to children, offenses in relation to putting children at risk through begging and using firearms, etc., offenses that relates to female mutilation, abuse of children through prostitution, and all of that. And so I would leave the bill here today. I want to applaud this group and what they've been doing, because when we think about reducing risk and increasing safety in any particular type of behavior, one of the first things that has to be developed is policy, and we need people who will continue to think about the policy and subsequently to make sure that those policies are enforced. And so I want to encourage you, even as your contribution has been to assist the government and various governments to create the proper policy that deals with the protection of children, and particularly that has to do with preventing child sexual abuse. I want to continue to, after the proclamation of these bills, to go on to make sure that these laws are enforced. So your work will not end when there is a proclamation, and indeed you have started a number of these through education campaign and communication campaign and various kind of social marketing. But there are too many of our laws and too many of our policies that are in books and in pretty places, but are not being enforced as it exists now. If the laws are enforced, we would provide a significant amount of protection to our children. And so we would be delighted to have all the various NGOs, CBOs, faith-based organizations, international organizations continue to put pressure on the government, and in my ministry in particular, to which is responsible for housing this bill and a lot of the implementation of it, to continue to enforce the laws. So I am happy to be here today to participate in this great project and to encourage you, to encourage me, and others in government to continue to make the protection of children, the rejection of sexual offenses against children, a thing of the past, a thing relegated to, as we say in Trinidad, donkey years ago, that these things should not be happening in our society. So thank you very much for having me. I wish you all the best, and I hope that it would work its way into the cracks and crevices of our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. And I'm sure the project manager and the people in the project will be very pleased to have a look at this bill, the children's bill, and to give their comments and to really see that it goes through in the way that it should. So thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and we really appreciate the involvement of your ministry in this project. This project has also been blessed with strong support from UN agencies, and indeed we are very pleased to have this afternoon Tom Olson, who is the UNICEF representative in for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean Office, and he has kindly agreed to bring some greetings on behalf of UNICEF. So I'm very pleased to invite to the podium Tom Olson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Dr. Grace Sirju-Charran. Honourable Minister, Dr. Lincoln Douglas, Ministry of the People and Social Development, Professor Rhoda Reddock, the Deputy Campus Principal, my dear friend, Mr. Professor Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, the Commissioner of the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. I also have with me my colleagues, Ms. Tammy Yates, who is here on behalf of Ms. Roberta Clark from the UN Women, Dr. Piya Pangsapa, the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Dr. Sandra Reed, my friend who's been working with us for a while now on the study, Professor Adeline Jones, my UNICEF colleagues, the UN colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, a very good evening to you all. It is a pleasure to address the opening ceremony for this very important conference, Break the Silence and End the Child Sexual Abuse. And I'm pleased to be here and to bring greetings on behalf of UNICEF. As the United Nations, which focus on the welfare of children, we are indeed happy to partner with the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women on this important research project and action plan. And of course, we are extremely pleased to be present together with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Economic, social, and cultural development is very much a political agenda rather than any else agenda. And we need the political will, Minister, and your words spoken is really warming our hearts as well. Because it's only through collaborative approach involving stakeholders at various levels that we will be able to break the silence around child sexual abuse and contribute towards the creation of a protective and enabling environment for all children. During our current program cycle here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have placed a lot of emphasis on designing programs to help stem the tide of child sexual abuse, which can leave physical, emotional, and health scars on our young and vulnerable children. We focus on supporting our partners to protect our children from abuse, because we recognize that creating the protecting environment is just as important to children's development as ensuring that children stay healthy and have access to quality education and services such as health. A well-nourished and immunized child who is sexually abused is not a healthy child. A young girl or boy anywhere in Trinidad and Tobago or anywhere in the world is unlikely to fulfill his or her full learning potential if he or she is physically abused. Abuse and exploitation can have a devastating effect not only on the individual child, but what is often not acknowledged is the cumulative toll that child abuse and exploitation can exert upon a society's social and economic development. We therefore look forward to the result of this research, which must now be used to inform programs seeking to break the back of this monster, which is child sexual abuse. I'm also happy that a component of the action plan is a media campaign seeking to bring about the necessary behavioural changes to tackle this problem. In Barbados yesterday, partners, government, civil societies and media themselves, we came together and agreed upon how to work together. Why? Our program, no matter how well-meaning, will only have limited success if we do not take the message to the homes, to the communities, the schools, the parks, or wherever the child sexual abuse takes place, or where children play, or where adults are. There is therefore no better medium to reach that target than the media. And my challenge to the media here in Trinidad and Tobago, join us, be with us, and walk with us, and help us to break the silence, help us to reach out to every corner of this great nation. From a regional perspective, I'm happy that our government partners in several of the Caribbean countries have now also begun to tackle child sexual abuse in a very front way. Last year, the landmark study, Perceptions of Attitudes to and Opinions of Child Sexual Abuse in the Eastern Caribbean, opened eyes across the region to an alarming picture of a child sexual abuse as a social problem which is perceived to be escalating, has increasingly severe consequences for Caribbean societies, and has multiple layers. The approach taken by several governments and partners, such as those gathering here today and this evening, will go a long way towards ensuring that we create the best world possible for our children. Changes start with ourselves. It starts in our heart and in our mind. And if we want to go 1,000 miles, it starts with one step at a time. Each and every one of us need to demonstrate leadership, but not trying to ignore a challenge or a problem, but face it, recognize it, because only then can we find solution and move forward by not only us as adults, but also involving children themselves. Each and every one of us needs to break the silence, and I'm looking forward to continue our journey together. I thank you, and I wish us great success in the future.
So I'm very pleased to call at this stage into the program on 3 participants from the Charlottesville Community Workshop, and they are Rianne McKenzie, Kayleen McKenzie, and unfortunately Shaquille Jack couldn't be here, but we have him replaced by Otel Murray, and we're very glad that he was able to make it. So we'll call on these 3 participants to do some spoken word poetry.
I remember when I was a youth, my parents gave me up, and I had become a prostitute. I remember when I thought I found a true friend. I remember when my life would not come to an end. I remember when I couldn't have a job. I end up in a club. I end up in a stripper club.
I remember when I have been raped by a young man resembling an ape. I remember when my life became a misery just because I had no one to counsel me. I remember when I want to commit suicide, and I told myself I would not commit such a crime. Then finally I turned to my friend, and I knew to myself that my life will not come to an end. Thank you.
I thought of telling the truth. I thought of going to my pastor, but my only option was praying to my master. He said that access will be much faster. by talking about my great disaster. So I stood up tall and told them all. Now I thank God, the Master, really and truly access was faster. No more sleepless nights, no more pain, no more hiding my face in shame. Thank you.
All protocols observed. We love that phrase in Trinidad and Tobago, so I'm going to use it. All protocols observed, ladies and gentlemen. As a graduate 3 times over of the University of the West Indies, it is my pleasure to be here this evening, and in particular, a graduate of the Gender and Development Studies program. I'm seeing one of my supervisors in the audience. I won't sell her out, but she didn't bring her baby tonight. I bring you greetings on behalf of UN Women Regional Program Director Roberta Clark, who has also asked me to convey her regrets that she could not be here with you this evening to celebrate this phase of the project, Breaking the Silence, a project that UNIFEM, now part of UN Women, has supported technically from the initial thinking through of the objectives and outlines of the project, and through the administration of the grant from the UN Trust Fund in support of actions to eliminate violence against women. All across the region, violence against women and girls continues to limit the enjoyment of human rights and personal safety. The UN Office of Development Coordination and the World Bank report on crime and violence in the Caribbean discloses that the Caribbean is amongst the most dangerous of regions for women. All Caribbean countries have higher than the global average of sexual violence. In recent work on policing and prosecutions of sexual violence, which UN Women has been undertaking in 8 Caribbean countries, it is clear that young women and girls, adolescents and children are most at risk of this horrific abuse of power, this outrage of violations. We know that such violations reflect cultures of gender inequality and unequal power relations in which young girls are especially vulnerable. We also know as well that the incidence of HIV in the 15 to 24 age group is in some countries at least 3 times higher for young women than for their male counterparts. And in my other capacity as the HIV/AIDS Program Officer for UNFPA, it's a reality that I speak of often as well. This vulnerability is related to inequalities, to poverty, to dependencies, which characterize transactional or sexual economic exchanges between young women and older men. Sexual violence against girls and women is both a cause and consequence of HIV, and is in part this interrelationship that informed UNIFEM's, and I refer to UNIFEM then because when the project started it was UNIFEM, and which we now know as UN Women's, approach to the Institute for Gender and Development Studies to formulate and implement a research and action project that would help us all better understand the dimension of harm as well as of resilience. For over 30 years, women's organizations have led the campaigns to change laws, and Professor Reddock spoke to that issue earlier on, to increase police efficacy and to change cultures that would secure gender justice, peace, and equality. This work, while it has generated significant progress, most particularly in law reform, has been to some extent hampered by a lack of scholarship and evidence on the experience of violence as well as on the impact of legal and social service changes. This research project seeks to fill in the gaps of our understanding about how societies can better protect the most vulnerable, about the kinds of actions that can build self-esteem, confidence, and wise decision-making on the part of young people. This project will also generate very concrete thinking on actions that are needed to be taken by states and communities to prevent child sexual abuse. Spearheaded by the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, St. Augustine Unit, in collaboration with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, this is a fine example of partnership between a research institution and an activist NGO. A fine example of how knowledge should feed directly into action and policy development. The Institute for Gender and Development Studies and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence have taken this project to far-flung communities such as Toco, Aranguez, El Socorro, Charlottesville, and Tobago. Using innovative methods to draw out information, such as educative theater, the project has been educating adults and youth in each community about child sexual abuse, incest, and the implications for HIV. We are very heartened by the involvement of men and boys in social settings such as bars, football fields, and basketball courts, as there is no doubt that cultural change will only happen when men and boys are engaged as partners in the work for ending gender-based violence. The project has also produced a number of exciting knowledge products which will contribute to the global knowledge base on effective approaches to address the intersection between HIV and AIDS and gender-based violence. These include the Break the Silence radio soap opera, as well as the book Sex, Power, and Taboo, Gender and HIV in the Caribbean and Beyond. UN Women is proud to be associated with this essential work and wishes to take this opportunity to salute the project partners, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence on their achievements to date. UN Women also looks forward to providing continuing support in this final year of implementation. And I would also like to add that the UN system in Trinidad and Tobago looks forward to continuing support. Thank you.
And now we are very pleased indeed to welcome in Trinidad Professor Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, who hails from Brazil, but he has been a commissioner for Inter-American Commission on Human Rights since January 2004, and he's also the first vice president and rapporteur on children's rights. He was named independent expert by the UN Secretary General for the elaboration of the UN study on violence against children, which was presented to General Assembly in 2006. Currently, he's a professor at Brown University in the US and the University of Sao Paulo. He has been the Secretary of State of Human Rights for President Cardoso government and has been Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Burundi 1995 to 98 and in Myanmar 2000 to 2008. He's the author of many articles and publications all about violence, democracy, and human rights. So we are very pleased indeed to welcome Professor Pinheiro and to ask him to come and give his guest talk to us this evening.
Good evening. Honorable Minister, children and adolescents, my friends from UNICEF, Tom, Mylène, Nadine, Begonia, Heather, and other colleagues from UNICEF that I'm not mentioning. My dear colleagues of the regional consultation for the report on violence in institutions. We spent wonderful 2 days debating this conference that preceded our conversation today. My colleagues from the University of West Indies, I am very happy to be here, having spent more or less 40 years inside universities. Then it is great that the launching of this campaign is taking place here. I had a formal presentation, but Milene, today, she told me that I had to change everything. Then she's responsible. She's associate responsible for what I will do here. I will follow the example of the minister and of Tom, to be brief, because I want to hear Adele Jones speaking here. It's a great title, this campaign, to break the silence. That is to challenge the silence surrounding family violence, school violence, institution violence, and contributing to the understanding of the nature and dimensions of child abuse. I have read your first report, and I'm very much impressed, and I think that's great, this association between UNICEF, the UN, and for some action inside the society and the community. What I like first to say is that you are doing that, we are doing the same thing, not as a favor to the children. It's not as a demonstration of largesse, of generosity for the children. No, it's for their rights. Children and adolescents are subjects of rights, of human rights. And this is very clear in the basic text that united us in this continent, because all the 35 members of the OAS have ratified the Convention of the Rights of the Child, with the exception, with a great exception, but this great exception that are not mentioned here, has ratified the 2 protocols, something that the region, unhappily, has not yet done, because only 4 countries of the Caribbean region have ratified the optional protocol on the sales of children pornography. And I take the opportunity of seeing the minister here to suggest him that it would be wonderful if Trinidad Tobago could join this special club of 4 states. Then the Article 19 is very clear, and if you don't mind, I read it. All forms of physical and mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation, including sexual abuse. This is very clear. 22 years, this is very clear, and all the states in our regions have ratified. I think that breaking the silence is also breaking the invisibility of violence inside the family, inside institutions, and inside this school. Because when you have invisibility, you deny the rights of the child. The imposition of silence and the maintaining invisibility is a denial of the rights of the child. And it's very clear that the Convention of the Rights of the Child requires states both to prevent all forms of violence and to respond to violence effectively when it occurs. While the state, of course, is not responsible for all the individual acts committed against the child, the state is required to provide a framework of law and other necessary measures to supply adequate protection, including effective deterrence. That is one also of the objectives of the campaign, breaking the silence. And happily, few states in the region, I'm not speaking about the Caribbean, but I'm speaking about the 35 states comprised in my mandate, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, have put in place the necessary laws prohibiting all violence against children, together with policies, structures, and reporting and referral mechanisms. That is very important, because the absence of reporting and of referral mechanism is the imposition of silence. Then it's the denial of the rights of the child. Then this is essential to address violence in the homes and the families, the schools and the institutions. Law enforcement officials in many countries of our region remain reluctant to intervene even in case of severe violence, child abuse and incest that is very much present and, in your report. I'm very glad that during these 2 days I heard from other representatives of the government of Trinidad and Tobago about the forthcoming children's bill. I think that it's wonderful. I hope that next time that I will come here to your country that this law will be finally approved. But I was very convinced by the enthusiasm of the minister. To conclude, I'd like to say that, of course, I became aware of this silence and this invisibility in the process of preparation of the study of the Secretary General on violence against children, where I became aware of this practice of child abuse inside of the home. Sometimes the homes are the most dangerous places for. This is a terrible contradiction because homes and the family are supposed to be a territory of love, no? And then it's of violence, of sexual violence, of incest. But that is essential to know through this kind of research. What is reality? Because you need to deal with reality to have policies, to have legislation. The same thing in the schools. There are schools in other continents that girls are afraid to go to the toilet because they risk to be raped by the teachers. Carol Bellamy, like the former director of UNICEF, liked very much to refer to the school as a safe haven for the children. And happily, in contemporary world, in this region, that is all the Americas, and in other continents, schools are not this safe haven. Then it's very important that with an alliance with government, with civil society and the children and adolescents, because they have the right to have the means to fight against these violations of their rights. Then it's very important that my successor, that is Marta Santos Paz, the Special Representative of Secretary General on Violence Against Children, has chosen 3 priorities. One, the need of having a focal point in governments for coordination of policies. Second, legislation, as the Minister has just mentioned here, and information data, so that policies can be based in concrete data. The Ministers of Financing, they don't play with numbers. They need to have the real numbers to have good policies, where if you want to have valuable, reliable policies for the protection of the rights of child, we need to know the truth. They need to know the truth, and they need to know their rights. The last thing that I'll say, and I read something that I have written for the previous presentation, and then I will say this, social attitudes which authorize and condone practice like incest, condone adult invasion of children's dignity and physical integrity, make every other sort of extreme abuse, including sexual abuse and exploitation, more likely and easier. The harmful impact of violence against children is well researched now, as your institute is demonstrating. And there are hundreds of studies reviewing the consequence of violence against children. The findings are strikingly consistent. Violence against children, sexual abuse, corporal punishment in the homes and the schools are associated with higher levels of aggression and antisocial behavior in childhood. And this association will continue into adulthood. If you want to reduce all forms of violence in society, including physical and sexual violence against women and children and against girls and boys, we must urgently prohibit and eliminate this violence disguised as tradition, culture, or protected by silence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sergio. And I can probably say it was very strategic of the organizers of this conference to put side by side our Honorable Minister and Professor Pinheiro. Before we go on to our keynote speaker, we're going to have a presentation of the drama workshop, a very important participant in this project, Arts in Action, from the Department of Creative Arts, UWI St. Augustine. And we're going to be calling on them to do their drama presentation. So please join us.
Gonna make it through this darkness. A light would shine someday for me. Yes, it will. I know that you won't leave me in this thing. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me? I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you'll put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. I'm breaking the silence 'cause I'm under attack. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. And take my life back. And take my life back.
She reached home yet. It's 6 o'clock. I have to reach the work for 6. I'm fed up, you know. I am fed up with this child and her nonsense. She knows she has to see what her little sister this evening. It's not the first time she's doing it. She always doing this thing up here. She has no respect. She will be responsible for anything. Good evening, Mommy. She come. Yeah. I'm going to where you was? In school, Mommy. School finished 3 o'clock. Mommy, I had lessons and then I walk home. You walk home? And I get the money to travel. You're not supposed to be traveling. All right. But when we have something to tell you, make it quick. I have things you have to go to work now, and you're late. So I am late already. After you leave, you're in the shift. Hurry up, make it snappy. Okay, this group come to school today, and they were talking about social issues. And they did drama. And one of the things that they taught us in the drama was how to know about good touch and bad touch. And how you know when a touch is a good touch or it is a bad touch. And after thinking about it, I was getting bad touch. So what? I don't understand what you're trying to say. I just be getting bad touch. What you mean is be getting bad touch? Somebody molesting you? Who it is? Somebody close to us, who it is? One of the boys in the school? One of them classmate boys? No, mommy. One of your teachers? No, mommy. Mr. Jackson next door? No, mommy. Then who? Somebody in this house, mommy. What? Somebody in this house. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. Who it is? Just say who it is. Mommy, Uncle Cecil touching me. Uncle Cecil touching you? Yes, mommy. And you expect me to believe that? Mommy, I'm not lying. What do you mean by you're not lying? All you're doing these days is lying. Mommy, Uncle Cecil, when he touches me bad. Uncle Cecil? The same Uncle Cecil and your father did put us in this house so we wouldn't be on the street. The same Uncle Cecil that put your clothes on your back. The same Uncle Cecil that making sure you have food. Mommy, I'm not lying. I'm not lying. Little girl, what I tell you about lying. Mommy, you're looking for attention. What is going on? I'm not even working here but to wash man. Mommy, I wouldn't lie for something like that. What do you mean I wouldn't lie? You're always lying. Mommy, I wouldn't lie. You're always lying.
What is this? This one line and that one line. I hear nothing coming from quite down the road there. Lie. What is that? Because I hear nothing from this house. What is going on here? Brenda?
Good evening. You tell your uncle good evening? You tell your uncle good evening.
Brenda, what's going on here?
Nothing.
Okay. I hear your voice from down the road, you know. So it can't be nothing.
Nothing good. We just had a misunderstanding, eh, Trina?
A misunderstanding?
We had a misunderstanding and...
What is not that? Is it school, something in school or what?
No, it's nothing like that. It's nothing like that. Nothing like that.
So what is the problem? No, I don't know. I just hear this set of noise. What is exactly happening? Brenda, what is going on here?
What's that? You're going to laugh when I said it. You know this girl should be lying.
Brenda?
So she come and tell me what you're touching. But I know that she's lying. Because...
Hold on, Brenda, hold on. What you just said that I know.
Okay, said.
Brenda, what did she say?
She said that you're touching me. I don't know what to do with her. She gets in trouble in schools and now...
Brenda, a lot of people know who this is.
Yes.
Stop standing there. Nobody ever hear my name called in.
That is true. And I never called her name in that.
Brenda, nobody never hear my name called anything. I know you trying to tell me that this little girl saying that I touched her. Why can't you do this little girl?
she said, but I don't get it. Cecil.
You know what, Brenda? Okay. I'm going on you. Right?
Yeah, you need to please out.
But when I go down here, and I come back, I want to see how it is.
But Cecil. Cecil, where we will go? Cecil, where we will go? You see what you cause? You see what you cause? On the island line. You see what you cause? I'll be happy. Mommy, I'm not crying.
I heard him say, hush, don't say a word. Gonna get messy if anybody heard. I heard him say, hush, don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you'll put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know who I am? A well-known woman, a respected man. I'm breaking the silence 'cause I'm under attack. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. No, I'm breaking the silence and take my life back. And take my life back. And take my life back.
Thank you very much, Arts in Action. And I think we need to remember at this time the passing of the Arts in Action theater educator, Samantha Piya, who facilitated a number of the Break the Silence theater in education workshops. And to introduce our keynote speaker, I'm going to call on the lead researcher in this project, and to call on the lead researcher, who is Dr. Sandra Reed. Dr. Reed is a senior lecturer in psychiatry at the Faculty of Medical Sciences of the UWI St. Augustine campus. And she's also director of the Caribbean Institute on Alcoholism and Other Drug Problems, CARIAD, which is a regional teaching institute. She is also, well, I would call her the Associate Research Fellow at the IGDS Institute, working on this project. And her research activities include such topics as women, drugs, and HIV, public health consequences of substance abuse and HIV, and interventions for high-risk sexual behaviors in marginalized populations. And of course, she's published widely in these areas. So I'm very pleased to call Dr. Sandra Reed to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure at this time to introduce the keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Adele Jones. Professor Jones is a professor of childhood studies at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom and director of the Center for Applied Childhood Studies, a research center engaged in child research in 16 different countries. Professor Jones, previously a lecturer in social work in the Department of Behavioral Sciences right here at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, specializes in international children's rights and is the author of over 46 publications on various issues affecting children worldwide, child abuse being one of these. Most notably, she was the architect of the Sunday Project, a flagship project initiated by the UE Social Work Unit, which resulted in teaching, research, and international practice exchange on HIV/AIDS and social work. This project culminated in the first publication on social work and HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean. Professor Jones has conducted over 20 externally funded research projects and has recently completed work on a 6-country UNICEF project of child sexual abuse in the Eastern Caribbean. This work has led to the development of national action plans for tackling child sexual abuse in each of the 6 countries. Further grants have been obtained to support dissemination of the findings and to explore culturally relevant interventions. Professor Jones continues to share her expertise in the Caribbean. Just last week, in collaboration with the Social Work Unit and the United States NGO Stop It Now, she was involved in evidence-based professional training for child sexual abuse. Her address this evening looks at the social and economic costs of child sexual abuse towards social transformation. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Jones to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dr. Reed. As you could see, we coordinated our outfits. We have an African theme going on here. I'm not sure where yours is from, Dr. Reed. Mine is from the Gambia. My origins are in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, and this is from my auntie in the Gambia. You're looking very splendid, I have to say. Okay, thank you very much for the privilege of being here this evening. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Professor Reddock. And I would like to say, yes, all protocol observed. Now, I'm going to do this presentation, and I'm going to be, well, let me just see if I can pull it up here, because otherwise I'm going to be twisting my head. If there's nothing on my screen, and all right, not to worry. We will go ahead. My first comment to you this evening is that the silence on child sexual abuse is deafening. The silence is deafening. What the silence does, it deafens our ears to the voices of survivors. It deafens our ears to the voices of young people, as in the presentation by Arts in Action. It deafens our ears to those people who have a sexual interest in children who are calling for help. And therefore, it is really a privilege to be associated with the Breaking the Silence campaign and this project. Okay, somebody come and assist me. This isn't moving on. I have nothing here that is moving this presentation on. Can I get some technical assistance? Please. You see, I should have done. To you this evening about the social and economic costs of child sexual abuse. Now, I'm taking a really big chance here because I am not an economist. And there may be some economists in the audience, and you may challenge some of my concepts, but bear with me. Child sexual abuse lies at the intersection of child abuse and sexual violence. However, despite growing evidence of its scale and its devastating consequences, child sexual abuse is now only beginning to receive attention. I do take on board what Professor Reddock said about the activists that have gone before us, the Joan Bishops of the world, the Dr. Sharps of the world, the Michelle Sograns of the world, who have been championing this cause for many, many, many years. But in terms of research, in terms of policy, in terms of discourse, child sexual abuse is not something that we talk about. When child sexual abuse is covered in the media, it is usually to feed a public appetite for salacious news about victims, or to spotlight the arrest or trial of an offender. There is virtually no discussion of the systemic nature of the problem, and rarely any conversation about how we might prevent child sexual abuse, rather than simply react to its existence. The presentation this evening draws from recent research, and I would like to acknowledge Mrs. Heather Stewart, who is a child protection officer with UNICEF Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, not only for her work in the initiation of this very important 6-country study of child sexual abuse, but the work that was done beforehand and the work she continues to do in the region. She is absolutely a phenomenal woman, and she hates me to say this, but it's really important to acknowledge her role in this. Thank you. I am not talking to the findings of this study, but I would urge you to access the findings. You can download this some 300-page report from the UNICEF website, and I would urge you to get hold of it, because together with the study, the Break the Silence study, it provides a very comprehensive picture of the systemic nature of child sexual abuse across the Caribbean. First of all, some universal statements. Nothing here surprising. Child sexual abuse affects children, it destroys families, it contributes to violence, to crime, to ill health and societal dysfunction in multiple ways. And I do recall when we were carrying out the study, I spoke to a minister in one of the Caribbean countries, one of the governments who participated in this study, and he said to me, I really do believe if we could fix this one problem, we would be tackling many of the problems that underlie crime, drug abuse, and mental illness, as well as our alarming rates of teen pregnancy and illegal abortions. I really do believe this. We know that girls and women are particularly affected, but the abuse of boys is under-acknowledged, as is the implications of the abuse of boys for adult male sexual behavior. We know that there is no single pathway for the experiences and outcomes of child sexual abuse. There are multiple pathways, and there are multiple social and economic costs. In conducting the study across the 6 Caribbean countries, we could find no one single causal factor, but what we came up with was a systems model for understanding the ways in which child sexual abuse is sustained in our societies. And each one of these boxes represents a whole aspect of this research project. I don't have the time to go into them in detail, but for example, when we look at the societal environment, we look at social sanctioning, what we see is the reification, the glorification, the commodification of sex. At the same time, as we sing about sex, as we sing about sexual abuse, as we sing about transactional sexual exploitation, we won't talk about healthy sexuality. At the same time, as when it comes time to celebrate sex, which is fine, we won't address the taboo of sexual abuse. We look at the issue of poverty, and very clearly, many poor families do provide good protection to their children, but nevertheless, poverty does leave children, especially girls, vulnerable to commercial sexual exploitation. When we look at inequality, gender inequality, when we look at materialism and consumerism, and how some of these elements in our societies feed transactional sexual abuse, how they feed. We found evidence in the Eastern Caribbean study that not only were girls being sexually exploited to put food on the table, they were being sexually exploited so that they could have the latest sneakers. It was not just an issue of poverty. When we look at sexually abusive males and we begin to unpack what that means, we discover that some of those behaviors where men have a sexual interest in children, that those behaviors have their origins in their own sexual abuse often, but not always. They have their origins in the way in which Caribbean masculinities have been defined by popular culture. They have their origins in our failure to look at providing support for young adolescents whose emerging sexuality may have been distorted by their early childhood experiences. As in the sketch that we saw by Arts in Action, there is an issue around complicit females. It sounds a very woman-blaming statement, and blame is not any part of any of these research projects. Responsibility is, but blame is not. But nevertheless, when you begin to unpack this, we found overwhelming evidence that women often knew but felt disempowered, largely because of their own economic dependence upon men, felt disempowered to act. As one woman said to us in our study, "I have to sacrifice this child in order to feed these 5. But nevertheless, for the sketch that we saw, the child's sexual abuse, upon disclosure, is compounded by denial on the part of the mother. The impact on the child is compounded by that denial. The impact on the child is compounded by her carrying now the burden of guilt for how will this family survive. When we tell children you were right to tell, we will take action. How do we address the overburdening of children already burdened? When we look at this issue of collusive officials, there were many examples of people in positions of authority and power who knew, but who failed to act. There was a minimization of the effects. I survived it. I got through. And in truth, we must acknowledge there are many survivors. There is much resilience among survivors of child sexual abuse. Women and men too. They get up morning after morning. They feed their kids. They go to work. They study. They function. There is resilience. We can utilize the resilience. However, many of those people who were survivors of abuse told us in our study, "I am still a victim of this. I am not a survivor. I am re-victimized every single day. I am now re-victimized in my relationship with my partner. I am re-victimized because I cannot stop visiting this issue as I parent my children." We found evidence of the lack of collective outrage. What Professor Reddock talked about today in terms of the campaigning and the marches, that is collective outrage. As one woman said to us in Grenada as we presented our findings, we outraging. We outraging. Ineffective systems. Well, those of you who work in the systems know that they're not effective enough. Male status, placing the status and the protection of the man's reputation above the protection of children. How childhood is viewed, a very crucial part of this whole picture. We need to understand how childhood is conceptualized. This is how we then begin to understand how child sexual abuse is conceptualized. It isn't that it is for me to say this is how I conceptualize child sexual abuse, and therefore on this understanding is how we base our policies. No, we need to start with understanding how people conceptualize abuse and then use that as the basis for education. And children's disempowerment. Professor Sergio talked about children's rights. Children's disempowerment, a key picture in this whole systems approach. That jumped. Okay, that jumped. Our UNICEF study identified very clearly the consequences of child sexual abuse, as Break the Silence project does. The consequences in terms of the individual, the consequences at the level of the family, and the consequences at the level of society. And what I want to talk a little bit about is, what are some of the costs? We know what the social costs are. Our survivors tell us. We know what the social costs are. If we try to look at this in some economic terms, we will actually find that we cannot afford not to address child sexual abuse. We cannot afford not to. There are intangible costs. What is the cost of low self-esteem? What is the cost of the continuation of interpersonal difficulties, family dysfunction, sexual dysfunction? These costs are intangible. There are some direct costs. The costs of psychological trauma. What are the costs to our society of early sexual initiation? What are the costs to our society of HIV transmission and other STIs, of family disruption? What about some of the indirect costs? Crime, violence in society, poverty. Child sexual abuse generates poverty. It impoverishes and generates poverty. It affects functioning. It affects people's ability to be productive members of society. It generates poverty. Lost productivity. If we want to ask some economically based questions about the costs of child sexual abuse, we might want to be critical about some of my ideas here. How can we enumerate some of these costs when there are so many intangibles? And who bears the cost? Is the cost borne by the families, by individuals, by the public, by government? Who bears the cost? And how are these costs distributed? Is there variation by gender, by age? When we begin to think about some of these questions, we have some very uncomfortable answers. The costs of child sexual abuse are borne most by those who least have the means to pay the cost. Another question, are these prevalence costs relating to recent or current events, or incidence costs relating to costs over time of not addressing child sexual abuse? And I just want to walk through some of these ideas with one of the young survivors who participated in our study. And I've called her A. I was going to give her a name, and I thought, you know, I give her a name, it'll be somebody's name, and I don't want to do that. But A, repeatedly sexually abused by her stepfather. She was fearful of disclosure. She was fearful of exactly what we saw unraveling before us. She was fearful. He was a policeman. The family were financially dependent. She had close relationships with his other children. She was fearful of disbelief. My mother won't believe me. So she dropped out of school, and that began a history of depression and self-harm. She began using drugs. Her boyfriend has been supplying her with drugs. Through her boyfriend, she was drawn into a drug and crime subculture. She became pregnant at the age of 15. The impact, the accumulation of these factors had a bearing on her own parenting. And she was also sentenced to prison for a drug-related crime. While she was in prison, she discovered that one of her children was also abused by her boyfriend, and she then followed this with a suicide attempt. And of great concern to her is the fact that her children live with their maternal grandmother, who still lives with the stepfather that abused her. Now, if we look at what some of the economic costs might be for young women like A in our society, and these are some questions I think we need to ask ourselves. What percentage of mental illness is associated with child sexual abuse? What does mental illness cost our society? What does teen pregnancy cost us? And what are the outcomes for children of teen parents in our communities? What are the costs of drug use and addiction? Can we see any link between drug use and child sexual abuse in our communities? And what are our prisons and justice systems costing us? What percentage of prisoners have experienced child sexual abuse? And what percentage of crimes are linked to child sexual abuse? And can these costs be reduced by preventing child sexual abuse? When we look at the literature, what other research tells us? Okay, what is the likelihood of A having mental health problems? Child sexual abuse increases susceptibility to a wide variety of mental health and destructive behavioral problems. Repressed memories, feelings of guilt, internalized shame, and low self-esteem are all well-reported contributing factors towards mental illness. Drugs, alcohol, and prescription medication are consumed as a solution to anesthetized feelings of despair and to shut out painful past memories of molestation. There is evidence to show the link. Early unplanned pregnancy for young girls who have a history of child sexual abuse is twice that of female adolescents who had a childhood free of sexual abuse. And in a US study, 60% of teenage mums were sexually abused in their childhood. The path from sexual abuse to teen pregnancy follows a very sad but familiar trajectory. Sexual abuse as a child, over-sexualized behavior and risky sexual behavior as an adolescent, withdrawal from school, abuse of alcohol and drugs, pregnancy, and adolescent motherhood. What is the likelihood of A being involved in crime? Victims of child sexual abuse are at increased risk of adult criminality, and CSA has been shown to have a long-term impact on the prevalence of antisocial behavior. In one UK study that we looked at, up to 50% of women prisoners report having been victims of childhood abuse or domestic violence. And what is the likelihood of A's own children going on to be abused? Well, we find that male sex offenders with a history of sexual abuse throughout childhood are more liable to sexually abuse children than those who have not been abused. More likelier, it's really important to know this is not inevitable. It's really important, and I will come on to this note of caution. There are many, many people who have been abused that are the best protectors of children. It is not inevitable. It's really important to remember that. Nevertheless, a study of women sex offenders showed that recurrent incidences of sexual abuse as children had occurred as part of their childhood more than. than those women who were in prison for non-sex offences. As I said, caution here. There are limitations. Taking one individual case and producing generalizations, very flawed. And how can we possibly know that child sexual abuse has been directly linked to those outcomes? And also, what accounts for the children whose lives don't follow this pattern? For the single mums who are very young, who rear their children, who don't turn to drug and abuse, who don't get involved in crime, who are able to protect their children? What accounts for the resilience and the strengths? But nevertheless, we mustn't discount the costs. So I've taken my analogy a little bit further here, and I'm using the language of economists. I'm suggesting business partners, Minister Douglas, the ministry, are business partners with everybody here in preventing child sexual abuse. If your business is the protection of children, please remember your partners are children and their families. Accounting. This is about accountability. We are accountable to children when we fail them. Cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness should be determined by beneficial outcomes for children, not what does it cost to protect them, what does it cost us not to. Deficit. Abused children carry a heavy deficit that will roll over year after year. Maximizing our resources. Children and families are resources too. In fact, as Sergio said, while children are harmed within the families, the paradox is true. The greatest protector of children is also the family. So how do we work to ensure that families are enabled and empowered to protect their own children? Savings. There will be savings by putting effective prevention strategies in place, but these may seem distantly removed from the outlay. The effects of child sexual abuse are often apparent only over a period of time. Be willing to take the time to see the benefits of the savings. And financial crisis. There's a global financial crisis, but don't be diverted. Children are in crisis. Balancing the books. Let's balance the future with the present. Future social capital and healthy societies versus present inactivity on abuse and the consequent costs. Oh, it's going to jump. No? And we are advocating a new approach. We're advocating a new approach. Probably nothing new about this, actually, when you think about all that's gone before us, all of those activists. Sexual violence advocates have largely focused on adults. Now, you notice we don't use the term sexual violence against children. We do sometimes, but in this presentation, we've talked about sexual abuse. The Break the Silence project is about sexual abuse. The term abuse is very important because while sexual abuse is a violation of children, it's important to remember that the way in which sexual abuse often happens is often in a way to minimize violence, and sometimes children are so groomed and handled in such a sophisticated way that actually the physical violence associated with it is minimized. And if we're not careful, they won't even recognize it as abuse. Abuse allows us to focus on the complexity of this. Abuse of power, abuse of trust, abuse of childhood. It allows us to see it as complex. Of course, it's a violation. But sexual violence advocates have largely focused on adults. And the primary driver for action has been a criminal justice approach. Nothing wrong with that. Child abuse advocates, on the other hand, have tended largely to focus on physical abuse and neglect, and the primary driver here being a commitment to children's rights. Nothing wrong with that. Both of these approaches are important. However, the first is solely reactive. It depends upon the existence of a credible and effective criminal justice system. The second somewhat sidesteps social and cultural factors, which mean that for many children, it is the circumvention of rights rather than the convention on rights that is the main determinant of their daily lives. So what is needed is a systemic strategy which focuses on prevention. Prevention. You think about the social disease that is child sexual abuse. We need to focus on prevention using a public health approach, which is centered on children's rights and is supported by a criminal justice system not reliant upon it. And I would ask the Minister to bear in mind the importance of focusing on prevention and looking at the public health model to prevention, because we have much to be proud of in the Caribbean. If you look at the public health model to addressing HIV/AIDS, we have much we can learn from in terms of our strategies, our systems, our mobilization of key people, the use of the media, much to learn from in terms of public health by focusing on this as a preventive approach. We also have to remember that in looking at prevention, families and communities must play a central role in devising their own solutions to protecting their children. We must help families to also invest in preventing abuse. And understanding this is the first step in changing the attitudes and behaviors that allow child sexual abuse to flourish. We must remember too that protecting children is best achieved by building on the existing strengths of a child's living environment, rather than expecting miracles from isolated and specialist interventions. We can never have enough experts, and we should never need them. Actually, families are the experts on themselves. How do we get them to utilize and own their expertise and employ that to protect their own children? So, towards social transformation. Child sexual abuse is a broad, cross-cultural and cross-economic issue. It touches every community. And preventing child sexual abuse will require dramatic shifts in the way society envisions children, family, and social responsibility, as well as addressing the ways in which power, sexuality, and oppression are manifest in our lives. And my question, several questions here: what value do we put on children's right to grow up free of child sexual abuse? What is society willing to pay? How do we direct resources towards more effective, cost-effective prevention strategies? Finally, social transformation is imperative. Do we believe it is possible? And are we prepared to make the investment necessary? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jones. Not only was this presentation very insightful, but extremely emotional as well. So we want to thank you sincerely and to remind ourselves of the model that you presented for CSA, but as well the strategic approach that we might want to take. So the floor is now open for questions.
Communities that I've worked in where the main forms of income are fishing and involvement in the illegal drug trade, and both of those are male, predominantly male-dominated spheres. So to access wealth really involves having access to a male figure, and so that sometimes that involves like sexual favors. And so I just wonder, does the public health model address the ways of providing economic independence for female members of a community?
The public health model is very much about looking at trying to find what are the causes of a problem. If you think about any kind of public health pandemic, any public health concern, what are the causes? What are the risks? What strategies must we do to prevent it? If you look at what happened in terms of bird flu, in terms of how we immunize our children, how do we prevent it? We don't identify a particular individual as being at risk. We focus on the whole public. In other words, if we want to protect our children from getting measles, what we do, we know what causes measles, we know what we need to do, we make sure that we don't just target an individual child at risk of measles. Every child will be able to access some kind of immunization program. Now that's the public health approach. So it's about providing information, seeing this as a whole of society problem. It's not just it affects that child over there, that person over there, it's all of us. And therefore, what do we all need to know and what do we all need to do in order to empower children, empower families, empower communities? What do we need to do? That's about that. With regard to income generation, however, you do raise a very crucial point here. And this talks to our systems model. What we would say is that unless you can address all of these different elements of the system, you are still going to have some factors that sustain child sexual abuse. So, Minister Douglas, the call is, in truth, that it isn't enough to have legislation and policy that says we have the best legislation in the world. That isn't enough unless we can address the feminization of poverty, gender inequality, women's economic dependence on men. Unless we can give women choices that allow them to protect their children, then we will not be able to address child sexual abuse in terms of commercial sexual exploitation, that form of abuse. I have to say there are other forms of abuse that we found evidence of, and I'm sure the Break the Silence project found evidence of too.
My main concern, one, is about I think in terms of intervention, what you want to do is to separate or to restrict the access of sex offenders or abusers to children. And I wonder to what extent that some kind of sex offender register or some kind of vetting of adults who have access to children, is that essential part of the bill? So that's.
We urge caution in terms of registers, because registers themselves, for those countries that have them, don't actually provide a protection to children. It's not a service to children. The other thing is that where registers exist, they actually have, the evidence shows that they actually prevent disclosure. People are so frightened of having someone's name on a register that it's more likely to prevent the reporting of abuse. So I would say that, and the other thing I would say is that it will swallow up a huge amount of resources to maintain a register. And having a register, what then? How do you monitor the movements? What do you do if somebody is, where do you move these people to? And I would like to say, these people, the abuser, the offender, it's not a monster. It's not a monster. It's an uncle, it's a cousin, it's a granny, it's a babysitter, it's a friend, it's a brother, it's a sister. It's not out there, it's in here. It's not out there. And we have to understand that, that while it's important to name child sexual abuse for what it is, while it's important to deal with people's behavior, people who present a risk to children, there are a great many people who have a sexual interest in children who can actually be helped. And any kind of public health approach also requires a commitment to providing treatment and support, not simply isolation and registration, because what then? Where are they going to be moved to? Even those people that are imprisoned, and of course justice is important. I have to say, restorative justice is justice too. Catherine Alley would be glad I said that. But justice is important. But once justice has been administered, where are people going back to? They're going back to their communities and back to their families. And I think that we really need to look at this rather than adopting models. I was talking to a colleague in the UK, a very, very famous child protection professor, and he said, I asked him the question, based on our UNICEF work, UK has so many systems, as does the US, as does Australia and Canada. The systems cost millions of pounds to administer every year. They have become an end in themselves. And children experience those systems as also a form of abuse because they're invasive, they're intrusive, and actually they don't deal with what we saw unraveling before us. So I would say that while systems have their place, remember that that's only one part of the picture, and let us be cautious about adopting models that come from elsewhere. Let's learn from elsewhere, but let us be cautious about adopting models that we might not be able to sustain, that might end up being counterproductive. Let's look very critically at them. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. And as is customary, we'd like to close by doing a vote of thanks. And there are a number of people we have to thank for organizing this conference, the start of the conference, at which I know there's going to be a lot more discussion and questions continuing, following on from tonight's question session. So I want to start by thanking, first of all, Dion Bucco, who of Free Spirit Media, who was responsible for producing the short film that we saw. Secondly, we would like to thank Catherine Chan, who is very responsible for all of the signage, the beautiful program, all the artwork. We want to thank her very sincerely. In addition, we need to thank the photographer, the videographer, all the multimedia persons. We want to thank all the ushers who brought us in and showed us our seats very professionally. The conference manager, Ms. Michelle Siraj, for all her support and preparations for this two-day conference, as well the IGDS staff, and of course UNICEF, Trinidad and Tobago staff, UNICEF Trinidad and Tobago, the staff there, who also showed continued their assistance and support to prepare for the conference. We need to also thank Arts in Action, particularly Camille Kwamina, who is the Theatre in Education Manager for the Breaking the Silence project, and Marvin George, who is the Artistic Director of Arts in Action. And of course, we wouldn't have had this session tonight if we didn't have you, the audience. We need to thank you, but more importantly, all of our presenters. So I'd like now to call on Dr. Sandra Reed, who will show our appreciation and deep thanks to the effort you've put in your presentations tonight, which was thoroughly enjoyed by all. So first of all, I would like to call Professor Adele Jones, our keynote speaker, to receive a small token of appreciation and thanks for your participation tonight.
I know that you won't leave me in this thing. Something doesn't feel right. Could somebody help me?
Our guest speaker, Professor Paulo Pinheiro, we'd like to invite you to please accept this token of appreciation on IGDS behalf.
Don't say a thing. Think about the trouble you put me in. I heard him say, hush, don't you know?
Honorable Minister Dr. Lincoln Douglas, we know you have a lot of work to do in this regard, and we'd like to show our appreciation for being here and supporting this project. I'd like to call on UNICEF representative Tom Olson, if you'd come and UNFPA Stammy Yates. Had a very nice interlude from the Charlottesville participants, so I'd like to show their Arts in Action. We'd like to call on Dion. He's here still. For your very wonderful drama presentation, which we all enjoyed immensely. Please accept this token.
I'm breaking the silence and take my life back.
By the audience to join the participants in the conference and at a small reception outside.